The first sound Salvatore heard that night wasn't Nafisa's voice. It was the clock. A slow, deliberate ticking that seemed louder than the harbour outside, louder than the ships groaning against their ropes, louder than the pulse he refused to acknowledge in his throat. He stood with his back to her, coat still damp from the rain, watching the port lights ripple across the black water. The city bent around him the way it always did, careful, obedient, afraid. Behind him, the chair creaked softly. Not a fidget, not nerves, just the natural sound of someone settling into stillness. "Speak," he said, not turning. The girl's voice arrived like a ripple through glass. "Your office smells like cedar and smoke." Salvatore's jaw tightened. The paneling had been replaced years ago. No one mentioned the old scent anymore. No one alive. He turned slowly. Nafisa sat with her hands resting lightly on her knees, her face lifted toward the faint hum of electricity in the ceiling light. Her eyes, pale and unfocused, didn't search. They simply existed, like closed doors that knew what lay behind them. "You asked to see me," she said gently, as if they were equals discussing the weather. No one asked to see him. "Who told you my name?" His voice was soft, but it carried the weight of decisions that ended wars before they began. She tilted her head, listening to something beneath the question. "No one told me," she said. "It's the name that sits under your voice." The words landed wrong, not threatening, not pleading, just certain. Salvatore stepped closer. The guards near the door shifted, unsure whether to intervene or disappear. He didn't acknowledge them. "You understand," he said, "that men have lost their tongues for less imagination than this." A faint breath left her, almost a laugh, but not amused, more like recognition. "You're not afraid I'll lie," Nafisa replied. "You're afraid I won't." The room tightened. Even the clock seemed to hesitate between ticks. Outside, footsteps slowed in the corridor. A whisper slid under the door. Word travelled fast in places built on fear. And by dawn, the docks would have a new rumour. The boss had brought a spirit into his office, and it spoke in a child's voice. Salvatore stopped an arm's length away. He searched her face for tells, tremor, sweat, the tiny betrayals of survival. There were none. Only stillness, like deep water. "What else do you hear?" he asked. Her brow furrowed slightly, as if the question had opened a door she hadn't meant to touch. "For you?" she murmured. "Two sounds." He waited. "One is very old," she said quietly. "It sounds like someone calling from far away." "And the other?" Nafisa's lips parted, then closed again. For the first time, uncertainty brushed her expression. Not fear, just hesitation, like someone hearing thunder before deciding whether it matters. "The other," she whispered, "is coming closer." Before he could answer, a commotion rose faintly from the docks below, men shouting, boots running, a metallic crash swallowed by the night. Salvatore didn't turn toward the noise. His eyes stayed on the girl, because the way she tilted her head, listening, made it feel like whatever was happening outside wasn't what she meant. The shouting outside dissolved as quickly as it had begun, swallowed by distance and the heavy hush that followed sudden fear. Salvatore didn't move until the last echo faded. Then slowly, he pulled a chair across the floor and sat opposite Nafisa, close enough to see the faint rise and fall of her breath, close enough to notice she wasn't trembling. "Explain," he said. She turned her face toward him, not aiming, just aligning, like a compass finding north. "I don't see people," Nafisa said. "Not the way you do? Faces? They're only shapes to me, but voices are different. Her fingers traced the edge of the desk, as if mapping its outline. Every voice carries something under it. Fear, lies, regret, sometimes kindness. It's like hearing a song and knowing the words, even when no one sings them. Salvatore studied her, searching for performance, for calculation. Instead, he found an unnerving calm, as if she were describing rain. "And mine?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately. The pause stretched just long enough to feel deliberate. "Yours is layered," she said finally. "Like a door that's been closed many times. Most people only hear the last lock. I heard the first." The words brushed something buried deep. Not memory, not quite pain, but the outline of both. Salvatore stood abruptly, the chair scraping back. Enough. He crossed to the window, watching a tugboat drift through the harbour fog. Decisions always came easier when he looked at the water. It reminded him that everything moved, whether it wanted to or not. Behind him, Nafisa waited, patient as still air. If she was a liar, she was the most convincing one he'd ever met. If she wasn't, he turned. "You can't stay here," he said. "Too many ears. Too many men who would decide you're a problem before I decide you're useful." Her head tilted slightly. "And what will you decide?" Salvatore considered the question longer than he should have. "I haven't decided yet." He walked to the door and opened it. Two guards straightened instantly, their eyes flicking from him to the girl and back again, searching for instructions that might define their futures. "She leaves through the back corridor," Salvatore said. "No one sees her. No one speaks to her. She's to be taken to the old harbour orphanage, the East Wing. Locked, guarded." The men nodded, but uncertainty lingered. This wasn't an execution order. It wasn't protection either. It was something far more dangerous. Hesitation. As they guided Nafisa to her feet, she paused beside Salvatore, and close enough that he could hear the quiet rhythm of her breathing. "You're not hiding me from them," she said softly. He didn't respond. "You're hiding yourself," she added. The guards led her away before he could decide whether to silence her or ask what she meant. Moments later, the corridor fell empty. Salvatore remained by the door, listening, not to footsteps, not to the harbour, but to the unfamiliar weight of doubt settling into the room. Because for the first time in years, he couldn't tell if he had just secured a threat or brought it closer. The explosion didn't echo. It punched the morning. A dull, thunderous crack rolled across the harbour just as the first grey light broke over the water. Seagulls scattered in a frantic spiral, their cries slicing through the fog like torn paper. Men shouted, engines revved, boots pounded on wet planks. Salvatore was already on the balcony when the smoke began to climb. One of his freighters, the Loredana, sat crooked in the water, its stern bleeding oil into the tide like a dark wound. Dock workers scrambled along the pier, some trying to help, others trying to look uninvolved. Fear moved faster than the flames. Behind him, the office door opened without a knock. Corrado Lentz stepped in, coat buttoned to the throat, eyes sharp with the kind of urgency he rarely showed. "Charges were placed along the fuel line," he said. "Precise, not amateurs." Salvatore didn't turn. "Casualties?" "2 injured, no dead. Whoever did it wanted a message, not a massacre." That was worse. Salvatore watched the smoke twist upward, thin and deliberate. Sabotage meant confidence. Confidence meant someone believed they could survive his response. Within the hour, his lieutenants filled the conference room. Voices low but tight, like wires stretched too far. Names surfaced, old rival crews, dock unions, smugglers who'd grown ambitious. Every theory carried the same undertone: betrayal. They knew the schedule, one of them said. That list never leaves this building. The implication hung in the air, heavy as the smell of burnt fuel still drifting through the open windows. Salvatore listened without interrupting. He'd learned long ago that silence made men reveal more than questions ever could. Still, beneath the analysis, beneath the tension, another thought pressed forward, quieter, sharper: timing. The sabotage came less than 12 hours after Nafisa arrived. He dismissed the room with a single nod. Accusations could wait. Panic could not. As the last man left, Corrado lingered. "There's something else," he said, placing a folded scrap of paper on the table. Salvatore unfolded it. At first glance, it looked like a shipping tally: numbers, port codes, meaningless logistics. But the sequence didn't align. The spacing was deliberate, a pattern. He read it again, slower. Then he saw it. A cipher he hadn't seen since the war. Simple, brutal, unmistakable. Deliver the girl before nightfall, or the harbour burns next. Salvatore's fingers tightened slightly, the paper crinkling in his grip. Corrado watched him carefully. "Do we have a problem we don't know about?" Salvatore folded the message once more, his expression unreadable. "No," he said evenly. "We have a problem that knows about us." Outside, the smoke from the Loredana thinned into the pale sky, as if the harbour itself were exhaling after a warning shot. Salvatore slipped the paper into his coat. Because whoever sent it didn't just know about Nafisa. They knew he wouldn't ignore it. And that meant they were close enough to be watching when he decided what to do next. The harbour was quiet by the time Salvatore reached the orphanage. Too quiet. Fog pressed low over the water, softening the outlines of buildings until the world felt unfinished, like a memory not fully formed. The east wing stood at the edge of the docks, a forgotten structure that smelled of salt and damp wood, its windows glowing faintly in the late afternoon gloom. Inside, footsteps echoed in the long corridor, each one pulling him further from the present. Nafisa sat on a narrow bed, her hands folded in her lap, listening to the rhythm of his approach as if she'd been waiting for it all day. "You came back," she said. "I said I would," Salvatore replied, though he hadn't. He remained standing. The room was small, almost bare. A chair, a thin blanket, the soft hum of the harbour filtering through cracked glass. He'd chosen this place because it was forgotten, because forgotten places didn't ask questions. But today, memory followed him anyway. "You heard something," she said quietly. Salvatore's jaw tightened. "You don't ask questions. You answer them." Nafisa turned her face toward the window, as if searching for light she couldn't see. "Sometimes answers start as questions," she murmured, "especially the old ones." He almost left then. He could feel the past pressing at the edges of his thoughts, a door he had spent years reinforcing. But the morning's sabotage, the coded threat, the way her voice seemed to slip under his guard, it all pulled him back. "What do you hear when I speak?" he asked. Silence stretched. Outside, a buoy bell clanged softly, the sound drifting through the fog like a distant heartbeat. "I hear a boy," Nafisa said finally, "standing somewhere cold. He's trying not to cry because someone told him crying makes you small." The air left Salvatore's lungs in a slow, controlled breath. He saw it before he could stop himself. The narrow kitchen, the chipped enamel table, his mother's hands dusted with flour. His father's coat hangs by the door. And then the knock. He blinked, but the memory didn't fade. They said it was random, he said, a voice lower now. Wrong place, wrong time. War makes ghosts of everyone. Nafisa's head tilted, listening deeper, past the words. No, she said softly. It sounds like someone chose. The room seemed to shrink around him. He hadn't spoken about that night in decades, hadn't allowed himself to question it. Random meant survivable. Random meant no one to blame. But if it wasn't random... Salvatore stepped back, the floorboard creaking under his heel as if the building itself had reacted. Careful, he said, though he wasn't sure if the warning was for her or himself. Nafisa didn't move. The past isn't quiet, she whispered. Just be patient. Salvatore turned toward the door, the memory still flickering behind his eyes. Not clear enough to understand, but no longer distant enough to ignore. And as he reached for the handle, he realized something he hadn't felt since he was a boy standing in that kitchen doorway. The certainty that someone had been there that night, who was never supposed to be. The night broke without warning. Not with an explosion, not with shouting, with a light going out. Salvatore noticed it from the car as he turned onto the narrow road by the orphanage, one of the east wing windows slipping into darkness, then another, like someone erasing the building piece by piece. He didn't tell the driver to stop. He opened the door while the car was still rolling. By the time his shoes hit the gravel, he already knew. The air carried that unmistakable scent. Oil, metal, anticipation. The smell of men who planned to leave no witnesses. Inside, the corridor was too still. No guards. No footsteps. Only the faint hum of a generator struggling somewhere in the back. Salvatore moved fast, coat flaring behind him, his hand steady despite the quiet rage tightening his chest. He passed the stairwell just as a shadow peeled away from the wall. A man in dark clothing, blade already raised. The first strike was instinct. Salvatore caught the attacker's wrist mid-swing, twisted hard enough to snap bone, and drove him into the wall without a word. The thud echoed down the hall, like a warning shot. Footsteps answered, more than one, so it wasn't subtle after all. Two more figures emerged from the far end, guns low, moving with the calm precision of professionals. They hadn't expected resistance. They certainly hadn't expected him. Salvatore didn't slow. The hallway became motion, a blur of force and fury he hadn't allowed himself in years. One man hit the floor before he could aim. The other fired once, the shot tearing into the plaster inches from Salvatore's shoulder before the weapon clattered uselessly across the tiles. Silence crashed down just as suddenly as the violence had erupted. For a moment, the only sound was Salvatore's breathing, controlled, but heavy with something far deeper than adrenaline. He pushed open the door to Nafisa's room. She was exactly where he'd left her, sitting upright on the bed, head turned toward the doorway. The faint light from the corridor framed her like a still photograph, untouched by the chaos outside. "You came?" she said softly, as if they'd planned it. Salvatore scanned the room, every corner, every shadow, clear. "Did they hurt you?" he asked. "No," she replied. Then, after a pause, "But they were afraid of you." He didn't answer. Behind him, boots pounded as his men finally arrived, breathless, weapons drawn. They stopped short at the sight in the hallway, bodies on the floor, the unmistakable aftermath of something far more personal than routine protection. Corrado appeared last, eyes flicking from the scene to Salvatore's blood-streaked cuff. "You handled this yourself?" Salvatore's voice was low, steady, but colder than anyone had ever heard it. "They came for her," he said. "Now they'll answer to me." His men exchanged glances, not because of the threat. They'd heard those before, but because of the tone. There was no calculation in it, no strategy, just fury. Inside the room, Nafisa tilted her head slightly, listening. "They won't stop," she murmured. Salvatore looked back at her, something unspoken tightening in his chest. "No," he said quietly. "They won't." And as distant sirens began to rise over the harbour, he realized this hadn't been an assassination attempt. It had been a test, to see how far he was willing to go for a girl he still didn't understand. The tide was retreating when Nafisa asked him to drive. Not to the docks, not to the orphanage. Farther, to a stretch of waterfront long abandoned, where warehouses leaned like tired men and the sea carried the smell of rust and forgotten cargo. Salvatore didn't ask how she knew the place. He just followed her quiet instructions, left at the broken crane, slowed past the collapsed pier, stopped when the air started to sound hollow. They stepped out into the cold morning wind. The harbour here was silent, stripped of the usual noise of trade and power. Only the water lapping against the stone, steady and indifferent. Nafisa walked ahead without hesitation, one hand brushing the brick wall as if reading it. She stopped before a corrugated metal door, its lock long since eaten by salt. "It's here," she said. Salvatore pushed the door open. It groaned in protest, revealing a cavernous interior swallowed by shadow. Dust hung in the air like suspended time. They moved deeper, footsteps echoing across the concrete floor until Nafisa's pace slowed. "There's something under us," she murmured. Salvatore scanned the room. Crates, rotting pallets, nothing unusual. Then he noticed the seam, a faint rectangle in the floor where the dust settled differently. He knelt, pried at the edge, and lifted a rusted hatch. A narrow stairwell descended into darkness. The air below smelled dry, preserved, like secrets sealed away. When the light flicked on, the room revealed itself. Shelves lined with ledgers, boxes of documents, photographs curling at the edges. Not smuggling records, not cargo manifests. History. Salvatore opened the nearest file. Names, dates, transactions that weren't about goods, but people. Political donations disguised as relief shipments. Contracts signed by men who now ran the city. And then he found it. A thin folder labelled only with a year. Inside, a report. Brief, clinical, merciless. A family targeted to provoke instability in the dock district. A survivor identified as high potential for influence. Recommendation: indirect support to guide future leadership. His hands stilled. It wasn't random. It wasn't chaos. It was a strategy. Salvatore leaned back slightly, had the weight of the realization settling deeper than any wound. Every alliance, every opportunity, every door that had opened just enough for him to step through. None of it had been coincidence. He hadn't climbed to power. He'd been placed there. Nafisa stood quietly beside him, her head tilted toward the faint rustle of paper in his hands. "They built the path," she said softly. Salvatore's voice was barely audible. "So I'd walk it." Above them, the faint sound of water shifted against the harbour walls, the tide beginning its slow return. He closed the folder, but the knowledge refused to close with it. Because if someone had orchestrated his rise, then someone had been watching every step, and might already know he'd found the truth. By the time Salvatore returned to his office, night had already settled over the harbour. Heavy, but watchful, like it knew something had shifted. Corrado was waiting. not pacing, not pretending to work. Just standing by the window where Salvatore usually stood, hands clasped behind his back, as if the view finally belonged to him. "You found it," Corrado said without turning. Salvatore closed the door quietly. "You knew where I would look." Corrado exhaled, almost relieved. "I knew you'd start asking questions. It was only a matter of time." The room felt smaller now, the years of loyalty between them thinning into something brittle. "Why?" Salvatore asked. Corrado turned then, his expression calm, almost gentle. The same face that had stood beside him through wars, negotiations, victories. "Because you were perfect," Corrado said. "A boy with nothing left to lose is easy to shape. Your family, their deaths created the man the city needed." The words didn't land like a blow. They landed like a key turning. "You're saying they were collateral," Salvatore said quietly. "No," Corrado replied. "They were an investment." Silence filled the space where trust used to live. Salvatore stepped closer, searching his advisor's face for doubt, for regret, but found only certainty. "We gave you opportunities," Corrado continued. "Protect you when rivals would have crushed you. Every move you made built exactly what we required. A leader feared enough to keep the harbor under control." "And now?" Salvatore asked. Corrado's gaze didn't waver. "Now you've learned too much." The distance between them felt suddenly fragile, like a bridge with one plank missing. Salvatore's voice dropped, steady but colder than the night outside. "You turned my life into a blueprint." Corrado nodded once. "And you followed it perfectly." For a long moment, neither man moved, because the real question wasn't who Corrado had been. It was whether Salvatore still knew who he was, now that the empire beneath his feet no longer felt like his own. The city felt different when the sun rose, not quieter, not calmer, just aware, as if every street, every window, every passing face sensed a decision waiting to be made. Salvatore stood alone in the office that had defined him for years, the harbour stretching wide and indifferent beyond the glass. Ships moved in slow lines across the water, commerce continuing the way it always did, untouched by the storms inside men. On the desk lay two things: the ledger from the warehouse and the keys to the empire. For the first time, they felt like opposing weights. Behind him, the door opened softly. Nafisa stepped in, guided by the faint sound of the tide through the open window. No guards stopped her. No one dared. "You're standing very still," she said. "I'm deciding," Salvatore replied. She didn't ask what. She already knew the shape of it, the way his voice carried the tension of a bridge about to collapse or hold. "If I expose them," he said, almost to himself, "the network falls. The city will tear itself apart for a while, and I lose everything I built." "And if you don't?" Nafisa asked. Salvatore looked out at the harbour again, the place that had given him power, purpose, distance from the boy he once was. "Then nothing changes," he said quietly, "except me." The silence between them felt heavier than any argument. It wasn't about strategy anymore. It was about the man he would wake up as tomorrow. He thought of the folder in the warehouse. By night, his life had split in two. Of the years spent believing survival meant control. And then he understood something simple, almost unbearable. The empire had never been his shield. It had been his hiding place. Salvatore picked up the ledger. The weight of it was solid, undeniable, proof that could burn through every lie the city had built. Nafisa listened to the shift in his breathing. "You already chose," she said softly. He nodded, though she couldn't see it. Yes. He moved to the safe, opened it, and removed a small recorder, the kind used for messages meant to outlive their speaker. His hands were steady now, not because he wasn't afraid, but because the fear had finally found direction. What happens next? Nafisa asked. Salvatore allowed himself the faintest exhale. The truth happens, he said. He pressed the record button. Outside, the harbour lights flickered on as evening crept in, unaware that by nightfall the power that had ruled it for decades would begin to unravel. Salvatore looked toward the door, toward the city waiting beyond it, because telling the truth would end his reign. But it might also reveal who would try to stop him before it ever reached the world. The city didn't collapse all at once. It unraveled. First came the arrests, quiet, precise, the kind that happen before dawn when reputations are still asleep. Then the denials, the headlines, the sudden silence of men who had always spoken with certainty. Warehouses changed hands, offices emptied overnight. The harbour kept moving, but the power behind it had shifted like a fault line finally giving way. By the time the truth finished spreading, Salvatore Virelli was already gone. No farewell, no announcement, just an absence where a presence had once controlled everything. Some said he fled, others said he was taken. A few claimed he never existed at all, only the echo of a name people used when they needed someone to fear. Weeks passed. The docks returned to their ordinary rhythm, ropes creaking, gulls crying, the tide erasing yesterday's footprints without ceremony. And one morning, just before the sun broke the horizon, a solitary figure walked along the pier. He wore no tailored coat, no sign of authority, just a simple jacket and the unhurried pace of someone who no longer measured time in threats or deals. The air smelled of salt and new light. Nafisa sat at the edge of the dock, listening to the gentle slap of water against the wood. She turned her head slightly as the footsteps approached, a small smile already forming, as if she had heard him long before he arrived. He stopped beside her. For a moment, neither spoke. The sky shifted from grey to pale gold, and the first ray of sunlight stretched across the water like a quiet promise. "You took your time?" she said softly. He exhaled, the sound lighter than it had ever been. "I had to learn how to walk without the weight," he replied. Nafisa tilted her face toward him, listening not just to the words, but to what lived beneath them. Then she smiled fully. "You don't sound heavy anymore, Elia." The name settled in the air, no longer dangerous, no longer buried, just true. He looked out over the harbour, the place that had once defined him, and felt something unfamiliar yet certain. Space. Because I finally remembered who I am. The sun climbed higher, painting the water in gold. Around them, the city began to wake, distant engines starting, voices carrying faintly across the docks, life continuing without needing to know who had once ruled it. Nafisa stood, her hand brushing the wooden railing as if greeting the morning. "What will you do now?" she asked. Elia watched a ship on the horizon, its silhouette cutting steadily through the light. He didn't answer right away, because for the first time in his life, the future wasn't something he controlled. It was something he could finally choose.